All right, Internet, we made it. We're live. Hello, Internet. Good to see you. Welcome to a special edition of Get Your News On with Ron, where I have a guest today, Shahid Buttar, who is running against Nancy Pelosi. Now, Shahid, you're a musician, which we're going to talk about that a little bit. You're an activist, and you are running against Nancy Pelosi up in the San Francisco area. So let's jump in right away, because I know you told me off mic you just came from a fundraiser or a protest, rather, that you were participating in, because it was a Pelosi fundraiser. Yeah. So let's start a little backwards from there and then work up to that. So, you know, I'm not a fan of Nancy Pelosi for all the obvious reasons. But my question to you is that when you're out there and you're kind of speaking to just general folks that might not be as entrenched in all this stuff, if you will, how do you break it down to them that Nancy Pelosi needs to go?
I just tell people, and I can back it up with any number of examples, but Nancy Pelosi is a Democratic Speaker of the House who, from one issue to the next, unfortunately advances conservative interests. She capitulated yesterday in a deal with the Trump administration to essentially fund his border and inhumane detention policies. We're talking about the concentration camps here on the border, without any protections for asylees and their families, without any protections for human rights. Knowing what this administration is up to, she still essentially signed the Senate bill without any meaningful resistance at all. And it's the very same resistance that she has reduced to a hashtag that has defined my career in a meaningful way for the last 20 years. And I'm tired of seeing, as since I graduated from Stanford Law School in 2003, when I've, from the impact litigation I've done, to the direct action work that I've done, to the, musical propaganda that I've been putting out for 20 years, I've been building the left edge of the movement, watching particularly the now Speaker of the House on issue after issue, from funding Bush's wars and essentially helping facilitate CIA torture, to insulating the NSA surveillance regime, to throwing immigrants under the bus, not just yesterday, but last year as well. The PAYGO rules, the fiscal austerity rules, supporting Trump's foreign policy, insulating him from impeachment. I could go on. But Nancy Pelosi is the head of the Democratic Party, but you wouldn't necessarily know it from the broad sweep of history, recognizing the litany of ways in which, unfortunately, she plays on the field like a 1990s Republican.
Do you bring up the fact that she has made herself a 100 millionaire well in office?
I feel like that's a better point for others to raise than me. Okay. I feel like it's the slightest bit ad hominem, and I'd rather confront her policies. But that is a concern for me. I think that when we see members of Congress getting wealthy, we should be alarmed. And the fact that the average net worth of a senator is in the millions is a problem, a very deep problem for our democracy, because it suggests that we are less a democracy than we are possibly a plutocracy.
Well, I think it speaks to her corruption too. I think it's a Truman quote, and I forget the quote off the top of my head, but it's like along the lines of, if you get that rich in office, it's because you're a criminal. So I think it kind of speaks to her corruption, and when you're trying to unpack that for people. But I understand where you're saying, well, it's up to other people to raise it. And, well, I just did. So there you go. We're making it happen in this interview.
I'd make it an analogy, if I may, between corruption and racism. A lot of people think of racism as prejudice, but racism is not just prejudice. Racism is prejudice plus power. It is an institutional phenomenon. And when I think about corruption, I think about institutional corruption. There are other kinds of corruption, and you're right to raise them. I'm just focused on the sort in particular that I have a chance to fix and address.
Policy.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay, well then how do you unpack if someone says, well, what about Nancy Pelosi? She's good on healthcare. She's been a leader when Obamacare got instituted. Yeah. I think she's the right person for that issue. What do you say to that person?
I say, to her credit, now Speaker Pelosi helped usher a bill through the House under the Obama administration that did include a public option, but that's the last time she showed up for anything that looks like healthcare for all Americans. In the recent, since becoming Speaker, her aides have been affirmatively undermining the Medicare for All proposals promoted by Senator Bernie Sanders, introduced by Representative Pramila Jayapal. Nancy Pelosi, is much more a friend to the pharmaceutical and the health insurance industrial complex than she is to public health, or the health and the interest of her constituents. And a lot of people, I do think, have this confused notion that she must be fighting for progressive policies because she's the head of the Democratic Party, not realizing that she is essentially the centrist brake on the progressive inclinations of a party that is increasingly inclined towards and ready to embrace bold, transformative solutions to the multiple compounding crises that confront our country, from the climate crisis to our economic crisis to the travesty and slow motion of mass incarceration to the creeping rise of authoritarianism in the form of mass and targeted surveillance. On all of these different issues, for better or worse, Speaker Pelosi has not been fighting for progressive interests.
How do you break down the concept? And again, we're still on the lens here of you're talking to just a general voter that you're trying to win over. Sure. How do you break down the concept of pay go to them and unpack that issue?
I say that in the 90s, Democrats and Republicans spent a lot of time fighting over accounting rules. And the reason they spent that time fighting over accounting rules is that Republicans favor a discriminatory regime in which the military and all of the corporate contracts fueling fraudulent, wasteful, unnecessary weapons programs are allowed to spend money into the federal deficit. Whereas, under the Republican view that Nancy Pelosi supports, we can't spend into the deficit to make sure that Americans have a roof over their head or can get to a doctor or medicine or food, right? Social services spending under the Republican demand, to which Speaker Pelosi conceded immediately upon becoming Speaker of the current Congress, that demand imposes a discriminatory regime that essentially hamstrings progressive social spending priorities, privileges military industrial corruption, and unfortunately gives away the game at the outset. And if we're going to have a Democratic Speaker of the House imposing Republican fiscal austerity rules, we should at least understand what's happening here and be ready to clamor as the left edge of the party for a new voice that would give us different opportunities in Washington.
So give me the 30-second pitch then. You're going door to door. You're saying who you are, what you're running for.
Yep.
Boom. Pretend I just opened my door and I'm bummed out because you interrupted my coffee and my breakfast. But go ahead.
Sorry to bother you. My name is Shahid Buttar. I'm running to represent you in Washington, here in California's 12th Congressional District. I want to make sure that you and your parents can get medicine and a doctor, and that your tax dollars pay for it. I want to make sure that your kids can survive the coming climate crisis and that we embrace robust solutions to it. I ran against Pelosi in the last cycle, got more votes from the left than any primary challenger in a decade, and with your support, I look forward to liberating the seat next year.
What's wrong with Nancy Pelosi?
Well, the very short answer is that she is sadly complicit in corporate rule. She's refused to let tired troops come home. That's a complaint that I've heard from a veteran. She has undermined your right to access healthcare services with your tax dollars paying for it. She's been a friend of every military intervention that has fueled the continuing climate crisis and the corruption that President Eisenhower warned us about. And when there have been Republican presidents in office, she has helped advance their agendas.
How will you be different?
I've spent 20 years fighting for your rights. For instance, one of the very first things I did after I graduated and had taught as a student at Stanford Law School was filed the very first case asserting marriage equality for LGBT couples in the state of New York. This was in 2004. There were very few Democrats, I could count them on one hand, in the country who supported marriage equality for consenting adults to marry the partner of their choice at the time. Nancy Pelosi was not one of them. I was. I am a cis, hetero Muslim male, and I was helping initiate court battles to vindicate the rights of my neighbors almost a decade before Speaker Pelosi showed up for the rights of my neighbors. And helping to initiate the movement that was secured, one of the very few areas where I think people recognize the progressive movement has actually secured meaningful gains in the last generation. I'm very proud of that. I'm particularly proud of having helped make a seemingly impossible transformative vision become real and change the lives of thousands, if not millions of people, if not tens or hundreds of millions of people for that matter. I'm very proud of having done that before. And for the last decade, I've spent my time fighting mass surveillance and trying to defend American democracy from the bipartisan assault on your right to dissent and your right to freedom of conscience. And that's an issue that very much alarms me as an immigrant constitutional lawyer. I'm not willing to let the vestiges of liberty die on my watch. And as an activist, as a lawyer, as a nonprofit leader, in the courts, in Congress, even without a seat in the policy sphere and in the media, I've been fighting for your rights for the entire 20 years that I've been out of law school. And I've watched for that entire time Speaker Pelosi unfortunately undermine many of the very same human rights interests that I've been helping advance.
So look, I appreciate all this, and I'm very intrigued by you. But my coffee is getting cold. I got to finish my cereal here. A big concern about me is my health care. I don't have very good health care. I feel like we're messing up with health care in this country. I also have a ton of student loan debt. I'm worried about. I thought that I thought I was going to become a millionaire with this art history degree. Turns out that's not the case. I don't know what to do here. I have a nice job, but San Francisco is not getting cheaper. Rent here is out of control, by the way.
It is.
I happen to not be in a rent-controlled place in this scenario I'm making up. I know a lot of San Francisco actually is rent-controlled, but Joe here, I'm not. So for the sake of this example, what are you going to do about those issues?
Those are all important issues, and I'm so glad that you raised them. And you're totally right. Our healthcare system in this country is ridiculous. It would be hard to design a worse system if you tried. We pay more money for healthcare than any country in the world, and we get the worst outcomes demonstrably. And we know that other countries with less resources than ours are able to ensure that everyone can get to a doctor, can get medicine, can get surgeries when they need them without needing to risk bankruptcy or healthcare or homelessness. There's a couple of things to think about here in particular. For you, as somebody who needs access to healthcare, you should have access to preventive care. It's cheaper for all of us as a society if you get access to preventive care. It's also cheaper for all of us as a society if we use our collective bargaining power, that is to say the government's purchasing power, to drive down the costs of pharmaceuticals. Corporate Democrats prohibited the government from doing that, which is to say there are easy ways for us to cut fat out of the system, to drive down costs, to expand patient access to care. And
so what do you support?
Medicare for all. Pramila Jayapal has a bill that would very simply use your tax dollars to fund a national health insurance system that basically the government would pay for. You could still choose your doctor, you could still choose your provider, and whatever the preventive or crisis care that you might need access to, it's paid for by your tax dollars, instead of spending that money on missiles and weapons and unnecessary wars for profit abroad and to support corporate resource extraction. I want to invest that money back into our communities, back into your doctor. And that's going to make both the cost drop down dramatically by expanding access to preventive care, by leveraging government purchasing power to drive down the cost of pharmaceuticals, by eliminating administrative waste across redundant layers of insurance. And we're going to get better outcomes, particularly because people will finally gain access to the same preventive care that other people around the world have long had access to, even in countries with less money than ours. You also asked about jobs and college debt. I'm still paying off my student loans. I graduated from Stanford Law School 16 years ago, going on 17 years ago, and I'm still $50,000 in debt. I am very concerned about the cost of education, and I want to make sure that public universities and colleges have free options for everyone, right? I mean, there's a means testing option here for forgiving student debt, and then there's a universal way of doing it. And I'm much more interested in the universal way that makes college a realistic, viable option for all Americans, whatever your starting point may have been, whether you have parents who themselves are college professors or whether no one in your family's been to college. It's not just the access to the institutions, it's the ability to pay for them. And colleges are another way. You can look at this particularly when you look at the government spending on prisons versus universities. If we spent the same money on universities that we did on prisons, college would be free for everyone. And that's exactly what I plan to do, is to support that kind of funding allocation.
So you support free college?
I do, absolutely, at public universities, and debt relief for people who are laboring under the burden of student loans.
Do you support Bernie Sanders' plan for?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
The key to Bernie Sanders' plan is that he's going to raise the money from a Wall Street transaction tax. And that's incredibly important because it basically helps unwind the distributive injustice that happened in 2008 when the economy was collapsing. And the Obama administration basically bailed out banks and left the rest of America hanging high and dry, particularly fleecing students, because Joe Biden helped pioneer a reform to prevent students from seeking relief from their student debt burdens through the bankruptcy that, for instance, industrialists or speculators or investors can access for failed investments.
Friendly Uncle Joe did that? You've got to be kidding me.
Indeed. I mean, Uncle Joe is not just creepy, but he basically resigned an entire generation to indentured servitude. And that's why I think so many young people are trending so hard to the left. You know, I think there's a confused, an ignorance, frankly, across most of the body politic about how there is an earthquake that is happening slowly across the country. And it's a very predictable one, because as boomers transition, and millennials have already become the largest generational voting bloc in the country, and they are the Republic's most progressive generation in our history, particularly because they grew up with Uncle Joe fleecing them. There are huge opportunities here to, for instance, introduce and secure a federal jobs guarantee. I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to participate in retooling the economy to create the sustainable economy based on renewable energy infrastructure that can be viable and present a viable future for human life on this planet. And the federal jobs guarantee will be particularly crucial here in California, for instance, in enabling some of the very high labor intensive jobs, like, for instance, clearing underbrush from forests that are otherwise prone to wildfires. For millennia, people did that, but in the westward expansion and the confusion of manifest destiny, we committed a genocide against the people who did that, right? And so no one has been managing forests in North America for the last 150 years. That's a very labor-intensive job. We can put a generation of people to work doing that. And that's exactly what we have to do, both to address our economic crisis and to build our resiliency in the face of mounting global climate chaos.
Well, Mr. Buttar, Joe Voter here likes a lot of what you have to say. And, I also, I pay attention some, and climate change is a big issue to me. I remember Nancy Pelosi condescendingly called the Green New Deal the Green Dream or whatever. Do you support the actual Green New Deal?
I do, absolutely. And in fact, I not only support the Green New Deal, but I want to make it stronger. I want to help develop it into policy. Some people criticize the Green New Deal for being just a vision. The reason it's just a vision is because the generation of policymakers who preceded us in Congress haven't shown up for work. Nobody's developed the legislation to enact a robust, meaningful solution to the climate crisis. That's why the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis is doing that work now. Unfortunately, Speaker Pelosi denied that committee policymaking authority. She even denied it the authority to issue subpoenas to conduct meaningful investigations. I'm not only committed to climate justice, but I want to see it effectuated in real policy that will, for instance, retool the economy, that will, for instance, ensure a just transition for workers displaced from fossil fuel extraction and using industries, that will, for instance, ensure that when we want, for instance, here in California, cannabis is a legal cash crop, but it's not legal in most other states, and it's not legal at the federal level. Part of the Green New Deal, I think, is legalizing cannabis at the federal level, both to allow access to banking services for people in cannabis industries and to allow interstate commerce and import and export of cannabis. That's going to enable a boom, a wave of green jobs in a carbon sequestering cash crop. That's beneficial not just from a climate standpoint and from a job standpoint. It'll be a particular fiscal stimulus to states like California and many across the South that could frankly use it. And I think above all else, legalizing cannabis is a federal civil rights imperative, because at the same time as building the Green New Deal, we also, part of a just transition has to include ending mass incarceration. We want to create meaningful opportunities for everybody, and the racialized caste system that our criminal injustice system has created is untenable. It is a blight on our species, not just our nation. It is a moral travesty, frankly. And legalizing cannabis will at least reduce one way that people get railroaded into the system. Even though here in California we have legal access to cannabis, it's still a pretext to harass, arrest, detain, charge, and jail young people and low-income people of color across the country.
Cool. All right. So Joe Voter is gone now. He took your flyer and he's very interested. He liked what you had to say.
Thank you, Joe.
So
is this Ron back now?
This is Ron. I'm here again.
Hey, Ron,
yeah, I'm good. How are you? I take this advice for what it's worth. I'm a comedian streaming from my living room, but I'd be careful when you're talking about healthcare. How often you use that access word. Access is usually used as a buzzword by establishment Democrats who don't actually support Medicare for all. You do support Medicare for all. So I'd be careful with that verbiage there. I don't think you were using it in a disingenuous way because you support Medicare for all.
Right.
But I just
think it's in a disingenuous way by lots of people. No, you're totally
right. It totally does. Yeah. So I'd be careful. I would, maybe frame it differently. But those are just my thoughts for what it's worth.
No, it's super helpful. I appreciate it. There's a similar thing I've heard recently with, we talk about climate change and climate delay and climate denial. And all of those terms, to some extent, I think are becoming discursively obsolete, because to speak about climate change or global warming themselves, sort of leave discursive cards on the table. When I talk about those issues now, I talk about the climate emergency, climate chaos, and climate crisis. Yeah. And if you say climate change in some circles, people will be like, "What are you? Are you Nancy Pelosi?" Or, like, we have to be a little bit more willing to frame the facts. And it's not just change; it is a crisis, and it will be chaos, and we need to build resiliency to it. And I especially appreciate your point about healthcare, not just access to it.
Well, I mean, I'm glad that they are at least saying climate denial finally, because before it was just like, well, I don't believe in climate change. And that frustrated me to no end. It's science. You don't get to believe or not believe in it. It's an evolving body of work. Yeah, exactly. Like you believe or don't believe in a God or something like that. That's a matter of belief. We can't prove or disprove it. Or at least we haven't been able to yet, one way or the other. But like science, it's an evolving body of work based on testing and hypotheses and peer-reviewed work and trying out different things and evolving what we have concluded. So you can't believe or not believe in it. You can either accept it or deny it.
Yeah, you can bury your head in the sand while weather events of increasing frequency and severity continue to inundate cities around the world that are dealing with floods. As the glaciers all melt and the seas rise, as droughts beset places that before were arid. There are so many impacts of climate chaos. Here in California, it's already killing people. There were wildfires last year across much of our state that killed dozens of people. And those didn't just happen in isolation. You can't draw a direct correlation to climate chaos, right? Because it doesn't work like that. But the climate emergency has certainly increased the conditions for catastrophic events, weather related and otherwise, in which people are already dying around the world, including here within the United States, including here in California. And even though the wildfires didn't reach our district here in San Francisco, everybody in our district for weeks last year was coughing because our air quality was some of the worst in the world. We had worse air quality than Beijing at one point, and it was because of fire from wildfires made possible and essentially encouraged by drought, which was inescapably climate chaos related. And so, people who don't believe climate change probably don't watch the news or at least don't understand it. And I think that there's a real need for us to get over that hump to now fight over where the line in the sand really is between people like Speaker Pelosi, who say they believe in climate change, they acknowledge the science, they understand the science, but somehow they won't show up to do anything about it. And those of us who recognize the science, are committed to future generations. I take a great deal of inspiration from indigenous wisdom to think about the interests of 7 generations hence. And that's why I'm in this race, because those people aren't here yet to defend their interests. And frankly, the predation of corporate fossil fuel extraction and the corporate corruption of our current Congress is driving mounting crises for those people in the future. I thankfully don't have kids, but I do have 9 nephews and nieces. I have plenty of friends with children, and I care about all of them enough, frankly, that I'm willing to dedicate my life to trying to make sure that we get some of these industries and fight back and make sure that we're making decisions based on our human interests and the interests of the future, not just capital interests and putting money in someone's pocket.
I like how you framed it. Thankfully, I don't have kids. Thankfully, that'll be do that door to door. Be like, you breeders, big mistake. I didn't shit the bed on that one.
I do feel like I dodged a bullet there. I mean,
I know what you meant, but it just came out funny. So you brought up the wildfires, which I really appreciate. The wildfires in California. This transitions into an issue that I know both of us have a lot of interest in. One of the things that happened in those wildfires was Verizon throttled the data ability of some of the people fighting those fires.
That's right.
Now, even if we did have net neutrality, that still could have happened, just to, cross our T's and dot our I's here.
Yep.
However, with the loss of net neutrality, there was really no accountability for it. We have lost net neutrality. We do have a good bill here in California. At least I think it was a pretty good bill that did pass. But now it's being battled out in the courts, which is why we haven't seen the effects of a post-net neutrality world yet, because a bunch of activists and organizations are holding the front lines to try to make sure we don't lose the internet as we know it, basically. So what are your thoughts on net neutrality? What are your thoughts on the concept of universal broadband? And you can go into the details as an elected official and as an individual.
I appreciate that. And I'll note here that I do work during the day in my day job for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I've been there for 5 years. At the moment, I will represent my personal views, which in places might resemble those of the organization I work for. But I am very deeply committed to net neutrality, and I am very concerned about the Trump administration's attack on the right of internet users to access the global network on the same terms as anybody else. I will say, to her credit, this is one of the places where Speaker Pelosi has shown up, and she did help usher the Save the Internet Act through the House. It now sits before the Senate. So at the same time, there's really two fronts at the moment. One is in the Senate, where even though net neutrality is a bipartisan issue and 80% of Americans across both major political parties support it, it, for better or worse, has devolved to a partisan issue on the Hill. And in the Senate, because we haven't been able to secure the support of Republican senators, the Save the Internet Act still has not been enacted into law. You're right about the efforts among states. California is one of several states that have attempted to secure net neutrality at the state level, and we're currently fighting a battle with the federal government over whether or not states have that right to give their own residents equal access to the global internet, or if instead they have to be subjected to the same federal regime that allows corporate predation by internet service providers, namely specifically AT&T, Comcast, and Verizon, who are the three bad corporate actors who have been attacking internet user rights across the country for years.
There's more than three, but they're all merging, so.
There's that. What I want to differentiate between small ISPs and the big ones.
Sure.
You know, there are many small ISPs here in San Francisco, like Sonic, like Monkey Brains, that are fighting for net neutrality because they want their users to be able to access the internet on the same terms as corporate behemoths. But the big ISPs, the big corporate ones, they want to use that as a revenue stream, and they frankly want to squeeze users for every cent they can get out of them. And that's where.
And there was an issue recently. You bring up small ISPs. There was an issue recently. Now, full disclaimer here, in fairness to you and everyone else, I actually have been reading about this via the EFF.
Okay.
But San Francisco very recently just kind of had a blow from the FCC, where the FCC kind of ruled in favor of Comcast and big cable because they were basically trying to squash competition in the area, where San Francisco had previously voted for more broadband diversity. And then the FCC came in and they're like, oh, well, this is the cables are, like, they basically said, oh, the cables are conflating, like the cables are being on top of one another, even though there was policy in place to prevent that from happening. So it wasn't happening. The FCC just lied and said it was, and said it was a concern. And then they squashed this.
Under the leadership of Trump's appointee, Ajit Pai, we really can't trust the FCC to do its job in a neutral way. I mean, I would say that about the entire federal government under Trump's administration, right?
Certainly.
But as long as we're talking about things that have happened here recently in San Francisco, I just want to point at another thing that our city did very recently, which was adopt the first nationwide, the first in the nation local ban on the use of face surveillance technology by government agencies, including law enforcement. And that's a campaign on which I've been working for 10 years, long preceding the recent fight in San Francisco, long preceding even the emergence of face surveillance technology. I've been fighting to limit the mass and targeted surveillance regime at the local level because Congress has been asleep at the switch. For 6 years, I led a national nonprofit called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. It's since been rebranded as Defending Rights Dissents, and I sit on the board of that organization. And it was founded, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, that is, in 2001 under the Bush administration to fight the Patriot Act. And so I've done a lot of things in that arena, from litigation in the courts to policy work in states around the country and local levels around the country, grassroots organizing at the local level, building coalitions to challenge policing abuses, not just in the context of surveillance, but also in the context of racial profiling and the drug war and the war on immigrants, stitching those communities together into stronger coalitions to then fight for broad civil rights protections that protect everyone. An example of this is the Community Safety Act, which passed in Providence, Rhode Island about 2, maybe 3 years ago. It is the strongest local civil rights law in the land, and I'm proud of having crafted several of its components. The recent ban on face surveillance here in San Francisco is the first of its kind. It's roughly the dozenth of its kind that builds on an established framework around the country that subjects local police surveillance to independent civilian oversight. And I've spoken out about that issue and written about that issue at some length for years. And I'll just say this, the reason I've been fighting at the local level is, again, because Congress has been unfortunately unhelpful in defending constitutional rights. And that's exactly why I'm running to replace Speaker Pelosi in San Francisco because I want, for instance, to support the kind of investigation that Congress hasn't done in the last 40 years. Every time Congress has ever looked carefully, they've caught the intelligence agencies like the FBI, the DEA, the NSA, the CIA, with their hands in the constitutional cookie jar, doing things as severe as what the Senate in 1976 described as a sophisticated vigilante. This is a direct quote, a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at suppressing the legitimate exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association. The FBI did that for 50 years, and frankly, they never stopped. But Congress stopped doing its job of conducting oversight, and that's what I'm very eager to resuscitate.
So, and I appreciate you bringing up the facial recognition ban, and I'll give a full disclaimer myself here. An organization that did a lot of work in that regards, who I know has some cross-pollination with the EFF as well, is Fight for the Future.
Yeah, they're great.
I recently collaborated with them. We did a campaign for net neutrality. And I was
part of the protests against the TPP, the rock the TPP.
That was before my time. Yeah. I mean, I was a fan of the organization back then, but that was before. Yeah. They brought me in recently. I was part of the. We went to Mitch McConnell's office and presented him, and we did this alongside Demand Progress. Free Press was there. Nice. Hispanics for media. Yeah, a lot of great groups were there. It was really cool. And we went to Mitch McConnell's office. We live streamed it. And we presented him with 3.5 million petitions for net neutrality. Nice. Mitch McConnell was not there. He was in a shell or elsewhere. You don't have to laugh at that. but his people were there. And then they were actually, they let us present the petitions. We weren't allowed to film in his office, but they left the door open so we could basically have the camera on and have the stream on while people were in there. So, it was a cool thing, and hopefully it works out. But yeah, I know Fight for the Future has done a lot on the facial recognition ban too. Well, so you bring up acting locally, which I agree is incredibly important on this issue. One way I'm doing that in Pasadena, where I live, I'm trying to get municipal broadband here. I've looked into a little bit briefly on starting a nonprofit for the cause. Still kind of laying some groundwork there and looking into it. I don't know if it's something I'd actually be able to undertake or not. But what are your thoughts?
We connect on other fronts then with respect to my day job, because my whole job at EFF is to support grassroots organizing at the local level. So let's follow up about that.
I would love that. Well, what are your thoughts on municipal broadband then? Because I know, you bring up there are some good ISPs. Yeah. The reason I've gone more the municipal broadband route is because it just seems like that's what we should have done in the first place. We need to take the internet out of big cable's hands, put it into the hands of our cities and municipalities, make sure net neutrality is in the charter, and we can do it. Look at Chattanooga, Tennessee. Look at Sandy, Oregon. And, when people try to make this argument, well, I don't know if every town in the country can afford it. Charlemont, Massachusetts has 7,000 freaking people. They're doing it.
Right.
So, yes, it can be done.
Yes, it can be done. And I would say that small ISPs can layer on municipal broadband frameworks, right? So when we talk about municipal broadband, it can look in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that can look is cities owning the fiber that they then lease out to small ISPs that, because they're using a shared infrastructure, will be forced to price the services competitively. That's the key here. The big ISPs, Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, they enjoy local monopolies, and they use those monopolies predatorily to extract economic rent from their users without delivering the same kind of service that they're entitled to. And I think it's the fact that the market is not competitive that unfortunately, predictably undermines the outcomes in so many different places. And municipal broadband is one way to address it. And the thing I want to raise out there is the public nature of the resource. We have an opportunity in our country across a great many spheres. Medicare for All is one, municipal broadband is another one at a local level, to collectively provide resources to ensure that no one has to go without. And that's one way that we get, for instance, to debt-free college opportunities is by pooling our resources. That's what a Wall Street transactions tax does, is pool our resources as a society to make sure that they're going where they will be most useful instead of where they will be more destructive. And that's what we do at the moment, is we channel your income taxes and we feed it to fraudulent military weapons contracts like fighter planes that we don't need to fight wars that they're incapable of fighting against enemies that we don't actually have. And we'll spend trillions of dollars on that while claiming that somehow we don't have the money to make housing a human right or food a human right. And I think that that's frankly preposterous. We have the money to make not just healthcare a human right and education and access to fire services, right? But healthcare, food, shelter. These are basic human rights. We have the resources to provide them for each other if we just make those choices together. Sometimes that's described as a lack of political will. I think the political will is there. The leadership is not there. And that's why I'm running to replace the Speaker of the House in CA12.
Nice callback. Yeah, I like it. Yeah, and one of the ways I like to describe what big cable's doing is that I kind of describe it. You mentioned how like they have these anti-competitive monopolies. I always describe it. They've essentially organized like an organized duopoly, kind of like the mafia, basically.
Or the corporate political parties.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly. like this is our territory. You stay out of here. We're going to stay out of here, and we don't have to make this any better because what choice do people have?
It's so funny you should say this. I wrote an op-ed in the wee hours of this very morning, responding to a court case. The Supreme Court yesterday decided a case basically giving away the political system to partisan gerrymandering. Yeah. And my solution to that, and I've proposed this for years since I studied political process and antitrust in law school, is, and I'd like to, as a member of Congress, legislate an expansion of antitrust statutes specifically to remove the exemptions for sports leagues and subject political markets to the same competition rules that economic markets are already subjected to. Another way of putting that is that the agreements that political parties and candidates make, particularly in the context of drawing legislative districts in state legislatures, the congressional apportionment process, it effectively reflects any number of horizontal agreements among competitors that collude and undermine the rights of effectively consumers, voters. In other words, political parties and office holders do all the time what companies are prohibited from doing, which is making agreements to divide territory. That's flatly prohibited under the antitrust laws, but only companies are subjected to it, even though capturing political markets carries vastly more risk to our society. And so fixing that loophole is one I want to do. And while I'm on it, just as long as the sports leagues came up, the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, they have statutory exemptions from antitrust rules because all of those leagues, frankly, violate antitrust laws all the time. I think particularly we should not be allowing antitrust exemptions for enterprises that suppress the speech of their workers. And that's exactly what the NBA did to Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. It's exactly what the NFL did to Colin Kaepernick. And we as a society should not be insulating those kinds of enterprises that undermine constitutional rights, particularly of workers. That's a labor issue and a constitutional free speech issue, as well as an antitrust issue.
So in summary, in very short summary here, you are using your law degree for not evil, which is very cool. Thanks for doing that.
I appreciate it.
So let's end on something light here. I wanted to talk about your music career briefly. So so kind of give me the summary of that. If you win, are you going to play at your own party?
I do occasionally DJ campaign events. Both for our own campaign and others. But I came up as a hip hop MC in Chicago in the 90s. I caught the very tail end of the original house music wave, boom, if you will. And I saw in the house music community a black, brown, white, rainbow coalition of people who on the dance floor, we were just all together, sweaty and smiley. And it was a togetherness that frankly it's been described in some tracks like Eddie Amador's house music as a spiritual thing, a body thing. It is a soul thing, and house music to me has been very resonant. The opportunities I've had to play music at places like, for instance, Black Rock City, where Burning Man happens, and festivals around the country have been, for me, very mind-opening and life-expanding opportunities. I've learned a lot in those spaces. I've met a ton of people in those spaces from lots of different places, with lots of different kinds of faces. And I see how much people are people across the various life experiences and places that we come from. I released my first CD in 2007. It's called Get Out of Your Chair. And most of the tracks on it, I wrote in 2003 and 2004 for a series of different protests. So I've got a funk song about the role and relationship between consumerism and militarism and climate change. That's called Bump Into My SUV. I've got a blues song about the war called the Baghdad Blues. And some of my latest tracks include Ferguson to Jerusalem. That's a tech house track that explains the interconnections among police violence scandals in different countries and the way that our supposed military aid helps blow back weapons onto US streets in the hands of paramilitary police and their relationship to human rights. I've also got a track soon to come out called Justice that riffs on poverty and homelessness and militarism. Maybe one I'd shout out, I have a music video for a track I wrote after the Snowden revelations called NSA versus USA, which is basically like a house music and hip hop history lesson about the recurring violations of constitutional rights under administrations led both by Democrats and Republicans. To answer your question in a different way, and to bridge it to the one before, you were talking about how I've had the fortune of using my law degree in a way that helps people rather than undermine them. I've tried to do the same thing with my music. I think of my music as documentary poetry, and I'm aiming essentially to help speak truth to power in all of the different forums that I have access to. And as a DJ, MC, singer, songwriter, and music producer, those are just additional arrows in my quiver.
All right. So
can I share one other thing there, if I may?
Yeah, go ahead.
It didn't directly come up, but just on the intersection of these things, I also try to leverage art as a community organizer. And I haven't had a chance to talk about this in interviews. So, just to put this on the table, some of my earliest and the work of which I'm most proud are organizing spoken word poets and hip hop artists to reclaim public space. We started doing that when I was at Stanford. I co-founded the Stanford Spoken Word Collective, which is now in its 17th year.
Oh, cool.
I co-founded a gathering that happens every Thursday night here in San Francisco above the Transit Plaza at 16th and Mission, and that's gone on every week for the last 16 years. And then I founded a group in Washington called the DC Guerrilla Poetry Insurgency, and this effort to bring together people around art and to use public performance as a way to bring people together and share the perspectives that oftentimes our corporate media refuses to share. I thought about that as almost, in fact, I have a rhyme about fighting the structure by building a people's culture. And that's what guerrilla poetry is to me. And that's where my heart as an artist is using poetry to inspire and to inform.
All right. So where can people learn more about you in regards to the campaign and everything else? Where can they go? So
you can follow the campaign at www.shahidforchange.us. That's SHAHID like David, FORCHANGE.us. You can also follow us on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram at Shahid for Change. And look out for us next year. I'll be up for election in the primary election on March 3rd. And should I prove successful there in taking the number 2 position in our top 2 primary, I'll be up for election in the November 2020 election.
All right, Shahid. Thank you so much for doing this. That's shahidbuttar.us, yeah?
Shahidforchange.us.
Shahidforchange.us. Shahidforchange.us. Check it out. Shahid, thank you so much for doing this, and best wishes to you. And I'm sure on the campaign trail, we will be in touch, and I look forward to it.
Right on. Great to talk to you, Ron. Thanks, brother.
Cheers.